My mother-in-law kicked me out right at the celebration of our 4th wedding anniversary, and my husband kept silent. Then I calmly rose from the table and said one phrase that made the whole hall, and my mother-in-law, fall silent. I was standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, adjusting the earrings Ramon had given me on our last anniversary. Small pearls, perfectly matching the cream-colored dress I had chosen, especially for tonight. 4 years of marriage. Not such a long time, it would seem, yet for me those years contained a whole life, with its ups and downs, joys and disappointments. Ramon was fastening the cuffs on his shirt, glancing at his watch now and then. We had to leave in half an hour to make it to the restaurant by 7. Estrella, my mother-in-law, insisted on celebrating our anniversary at a restaurant instead of at home, as I had suggested. She booked a table at an expensive place downtown, invited all of Ramon's relatives and some of our mutual acquaintances. That made about 35 people. I had wanted a modest family dinner, maybe just the 2 of us. But my mother-in-law declared that 4 years was a serious date and should be celebrated properly. Arguing with her was pointless. Over the years, I had learned to choose my battles, to know when it was wiser to remain silent. Ramon came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and kissed my neck. He smelled of the expensive perfume I had given him for New Year's. In moments like this, I remembered why I had fallen in love with him 5 years ago. Tall, broad-shouldered, with gentle brown eyes and a charming smile. He worked as an architect for a large construction company, ambitious and full of promise. We had met at my friend Teresa's birthday party. Ramon came with her brother. They studied together at university. We spent the entire evening on the balcony, forgetting about the celebration. He told me about his projects, about his dream of building the perfect house where every detail was thought through. At the time, I worked as an editor at a publishing house, and we found so much in common. A month later, he proposed. Perhaps it was too soon, but it felt like we had known each other forever. The wedding was lavish. Estrella took charge of the entire organization, 150 guests, an outdoor ceremony at a country mansion, live music, fireworks. I had dreamed of an intimate ceremony by the sea, but my mother-in-law said her only son had to marry properly. My parents lived in a small town 800 kilometers from the capital. My father taught physics at school. My mother was a nurse at the local clinic. They arrived at the wedding bewildered, overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Later, my mother confessed she had felt out of place among the fancy outfits and conversations about exotic resorts. The first year was nearly perfect. We rented a bright 2-room apartment not far from the center with large windows. Ramon was busy with a major housing project and often stayed late at the office. I, too, was absorbed in work, received a promotion, and became a senior editor. On weekends, we walked in the park, went to theaters and museums, met friends. Estrella called every day, asking how we were, what we ate, if we needed help. Sometimes she came over with containers of homemade food, saying young people had no time to cook. I thanked her, though I loved cooking and always made time for it. The problems began when we decided to buy our own apartment. Both Ramon and I had savings. We found a good option in a new building, a 3-room flat with a spacious kitchen and 2 bathrooms. Estrella insisted on coming with us to see it. She didn't like anything. The neighborhood was wrong, the layout inconvenient, the view depressing, the neighbors surely noisy. She found another option in a luxury complex where her friend lived. It cost 1.5 times more, which meant taking on a huge loan. Ramon hesitated, but eventually sided with his mother. We bought the apartment she chose. The move was difficult, not so much physically as emotionally. Estrella came every day, directing the furniture arrangement, choosing curtains, advising on dishes. When I gently hinted that we could manage on our own, she took offense. She said she only wanted to help, that she had more experience, that she wished us well. Ramon asked me to be more patient. He reminded me his mother was lonely after his father's death, that we were her only joy. His father, Miguel, had died of a heart attack 2 years before our wedding, at just 58. He'd been a chief engineer at a factory, smoked a lot, worked too hard, and rested too little. Estrella had taken the loss very hard. Ramon said she barely left the house for months, lost weight, stopped caring about her appearance. Eventually, she began to recover, but she was never the same. All her unspent care poured onto her son. I tried to be a good daughter-in-law, called her, invited her to dinner, helped with shopping when she asked, but the more I tried, the more she demanded. If I cooked borscht, she said I hadn't added enough salt. If I baked a pie, she complained the dough was too tough. If I bought her a birthday gift, she hinted she had wanted something else. Ramon didn't notice, or pretended not to. The second year of our marriage was marked by Estrella's constant presence. She had a key to our apartment. She could come any time, and often I returned from work to find her cooking dinner in my kitchen. She rearranged things in cupboards, replaced towels I had chosen with new ones, brought houseplants, and sulked when they died. Once I came home and found she had rehung all the paintings in the living room. She said it was more harmonious that way. Ramon worked even more, eventually promoted to head of a department. The new role meant business trips, late meetings, weekends at the office. I too was busy, but I tried to spend more time at home, hoping for rare evenings together. But even when Ramon was home, there was no peace. Estrella called several times an evening, asking advice about trivial matters, complaining about her health, asking for help. In our 3rd year of marriage, I became pregnant. We hadn't planned a child so soon. We wanted to stabilize financially first, to take a big trip we had dreamed of. But those 2 lines on the test changed everything. Ramon was overjoyed, lifted me in his arms, kissed my stomach, promising he would be the best father in the world. When Estrella learned the news, she burst into tears of joy, said it was the greatest gift, that she had been waiting for grandchildren so long. From that day, her control multiplied. She wrote out a list of foods I had to eat, scheduled an appointment with her gynecologist friend, though I already had a trusted doctor, bought stacks of books on pregnancy and motherhood, demanded that I read them. She came every day, touched my stomach, gave advice, shared horror stories of what might go wrong if I didn't follow every rule. I began avoiding her, making excuses not to be home when she visited. She complained to Ramon that I disrespected her, that I deprived her of the joy of preparing for her grandchild. In the 4th month, I miscarried. It happened suddenly, at night. Sharp pain, bleeding, ambulance, hospital. The doctors said it happens, that it wasn't my fault, that we could try again in 6 months. But I blamed myself. Maybe I worked too much, maybe I ate wrong, maybe the stress of my mother-in-law's constant presence played a role. Ramon supported me as best he could, took leave, stayed by my side, comforted me. But Estrella... She came to the hospital, and the first thing she said was that I must have done something wrong, that if I had listened to her, gone to her doctor, everything would have been fine. Ramon asked her to leave, but the wound was already there. From that day, something broke, not between me and Ramon, but between me and his mother. I could no longer pretend her words didn't hurt me, that her presence wasn't suffocating. After the miscarriage, I withdrew, worked mechanically, tried to distract myself at home any way I could. Ramon tried to talk, suggested a vacation, a change of scenery, but I wasn't ready. Estrella kept coming, but now I locked the door from the inside, didn't answer her calls. She complained to Ramon that I was unstable, that I needed a psychologist. Perhaps she was right, but hearing it from her was unbearable. 6 months passed. The wound healed, but the scar remained. Ramon and I slowly returned to normal. He was home more often. We began to talk again, not just about chores, but about feelings, plans, dreams. We decided we'd try again for a child, but not yet. Maybe in a year or 2. Estrella stepped back a little. Maybe Ramon had spoken with her, or maybe she herself realized she had gone too far. And then our 4th anniversary approached. I thought we'd spend it together, quietly, perhaps dining at that little Italian restaurant where Ramon had proposed. But Estrella had other plans. 2 weeks before the date, she called to inform me she had booked a banquet hall, invited relatives, ordered a cake. I tried to object, said we wanted a modest celebration. She replied that 4 years was important, that everyone expected a party, and she had already paid. As usual, Ramon was caught between us. He understood I wanted a quiet evening, but didn't want to upset his mother. He convinced me to agree, promising we'd stay just a couple of hours, greet the guests, then leave to continue the evening alone. I agreed, though everything in me resisted. A week before the anniversary, I went to visit my parents. They had been asking me to come for ages. My mother immediately noticed I had lost weight, that I had dark circles under my eyes. I told her about the upcoming party, about how I dreaded the grand gathering. She hugged me and said the most important thing was the love between me and Ramon. The rest didn't matter. My father added that perhaps my mother-in-law was just lonely and wanted to feel part of our lives. I knew they were right, but it didn't make it easier. When I returned home, I found Estrella in our apartment, laying out dresses she had bought for me on our bed. She said she had chosen several options for the anniversary, so I could look worthy before the guests. The dresses were beautiful and expensive, but not my style at all. Bright colors, deep necklines, sequins. I thanked her, said I already had a dress. She pursed her lips, said I always dressed too modestly, that Ramon's wife should look the part of his status. That evening, Ramon came home, exhausted after a long meeting. Estrella was still there, cooking dinner. She told him about the dresses, complained that I refused to try them on. Ramon gave me a weary look and asked me to try at least one, so as not to upset his mother. I agreed, picked the most modest one, dark green, long, with a closed neckline. Estrella was pleased, said I had finally listened to her advice. 3 days before the anniversary, she brought me the guest list. 37 people. I knew maybe half of them. The rest were Ramon's distant relatives, Estrella's former colleagues, her yoga friends, neighbors. I asked if I could invite my parents. She said the seating was limited, but if they managed to come, then of course. I knew my parents wouldn't be able to come. My father had final exams at school that week, and my mother was on duty at the clinic. The day before the celebration, I took a day off work to prepare. I went to the beauty salon, had my hair styled and nails done, bought a gift for Ramon, the watch he had been eyeing for a long time. For myself, I bought new lingerie, hoping that after the official part, we'd have time to be together. Estrella called every hour, checking details, reminding me what time to arrive, what to say in the welcome speech, how to behave. On the morning of the anniversary, I woke with a heavy sense of foreboding. Something was going to happen. I felt it. Ramon was already up making breakfast. He brought me coffee in bed, kissed me, congratulated me on our anniversary, and gave me a bracelet. Thin, elegant, with tiny diamonds. I gave him the watch. We had breakfast together, unhurried for the first time in ages, talking about how quickly these 4 years had flown by, recalling funny moments, making plans for the future. Then the preparations began. I put on the dark green dress Estrella had chosen. I did my makeup, pulled my hair into a low bun. Ramon wore the suit I had given him for his last birthday. We looked like a beautiful couple, but looking at our reflection in the mirror, I saw the fatigue in our eyes, the tension in our postures. Neither of us wanted this party, but we were going as if to work. On the way to the restaurant, we were silent. Ramon held my hand, sometimes squeezed it, as if apologizing for not standing up for our right to a quiet evening. I squeezed back, letting him know I didn't blame him. We were both prisoners of the situation, too well-mannered to cause a scene, too tired to fight. The restaurant greeted us with soft lighting and quiet music. The banquet hall was decorated with white and gold balloons. Bouquets of white roses stood on the tables, beautiful, tasteful, expensive. Estrella met us at the entrance, dressed in a dark purple gown, her hair and makeup perfect. She kissed Ramon, gave me a nod, and immediately started giving orders. Where to stand, whom to greet first, what to say. Guests began to arrive. First came Estrella's parents, Ramon's grandparents, already over 80, but still sprightly. Then came the siblings of Ramon's late father, their children, grandchildren, then Estrella's colleagues and friends. From our mutual friends, only 2 showed up. The rest were away on business trips at their dachas, or simply didn't want to come, knowing about the tense atmosphere in our family. Ramon and I greeted the guests, accepted congratulations, smiled, thanked them. Estrella fluttered around, telling everyone how she had organized the celebration, which dishes she had ordered, what cake was waiting at the end of the evening. From time to time, she cast me disapproving looks when I didn't smile widely enough or thank someone with sufficient enthusiasm. At last, everyone sat down. Ramon and I were placed at the head of the table. Estrella took the seat at his right. To my left was her friend Margarita, a sharp-tongued woman in her 60s with a habit of prying into things that weren't her business. She immediately began asking why we hadn't had children yet, saying it was about time, that Estrella dreamed of grandchildren. The toasts began. Ramon's grandfather spoke first, wishing us many years together, patience and wisdom. Then Estrella gave her speech. She went on about what a wonderful son Ramon was, how proud she was of him, how glad she was that he had found a wife. About me, she said, only that she hoped I would be a good wife and mother. The guests applauded, raised their glasses. I drank juice. Ever since the miscarriage, alcohol made me nauseous. The evening dragged endlessly. Guests ate, drank, danced. Estrella kept coming over with remarks. I wasn't attentive enough to the guests. I wasn't holding my fork properly. I wasn't eating enough. Ramon tried to distract her, took her to dance, but she always came back. I felt the tension inside me building, my smile harder and harder to maintain. Around 9 o'clock, when the main course was served, Estrella stood up and asked for attention. She said she had an important announcement. My heart skipped a beat. What now? A vacation package to some resort I didn't want to visit? Parenting classes we hadn't asked for? She started from afar, talking about how she had dreamed of grandchildren, how she had waited for Ramon to marry and start a family, how happy she had been when he brought me home to meet her. I tensed. Where was this going? Then she moved on to say that 4 years was enough time to know whether 2 people suited each other, and sometimes one had to admit a mistake in choosing. I felt the blood drain from my face. Could she really be about to say what I thought? Ramon stiffened beside me, took my hand under the table. Estrella went on, saying I was a good girl but perhaps not suitable for their family, that I was too reserved, too independent, not capable of being a good wife. That after the loss of the child, I had grown distant, cold, unapproachable. The guests fell silent. Some lowered their eyes, others watched me curiously, waiting for my reaction. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to believe this was really happening. Estrella concluded by saying she thought Ramon and I should part ways, that it would be better for everyone, and that she had already picked out a good match for her son. The daughter of a friend, a doctor from a good family. The hall fell into absolute silence. Everyone looked at me, waiting for me to speak, to act. I turned my eyes to Ramon. He sat pale, clutching my hand, but silent. He didn't get up, didn't stop his mother, didn't say a single word in my defense. That silence hurt more than anything Estrella had said. At that moment, I knew our marriage was truly over, not because of her words, but because of his silence. I slowly stood, let go of my husband's hand, smoothed my dress, and looked at my mother-in-law. She stood there, triumphant, certain of her righteousness, of her victory. I glanced around the hall. All those people I barely knew who cared nothing for me. yet who watched eagerly as if this were entertainment. My mind suddenly felt empty and clear. No pain, no anger, just cold clarity. I knew what I would say. The words came to me on their own, as if they had been waiting for this moment for all 4 years. Before speaking them, I swept my eyes over the room once more. Margarita, sitting to my left, covered her mouth with her hand, but in her eyes burned open curiosity. She was enjoying the spectacle. Ramon's uncles exchanged glances. Their wives whispered. His grandparents looked bewildered, not understanding how a celebration had turned into a public execution. I looked at our 2 friends, Alejandro and his wife Lucia, sitting at the far end of the table. Lucia watched me with sympathy. Alejandro clenched his fists, barely restraining himself from stepping in. They knew of my difficult relationship with Estrella, had often advised me to stand up to her, but I had always said I didn't want to ruin things with Ramon, that in time it would get better. Time. 4 years I had waited for time to heal things, for Estrella to accept me, for Ramon to protect our family from his mother's interference. But time had only made things worse. Each month Estrella grew more controlling, and Ramon withdrew further, preferring to ignore the problem. I remembered the first moment I realized Ramon would never take my side. It was 6 months after our wedding. Estrella showed up unannounced when we were about to leave for a concert of our favorite band. Tickets had been hard to get. We'd been planning for weeks, but she claimed she felt unwell, needed help. Ramon immediately canceled our plans. I suggested calling her a taxi to the hospital or an ambulance if it was serious, but it turned out her blood pressure had risen after the neighbor said something unpleasant. We spent the evening at her place, listening to complaints. The concert went on without us. Then came dozens of such situations. Canceled trips, ruined weekends, interrupted romantic evenings. Estrella always found a reason to interfere, and Ramon always found excuses. She's lonely, she misses father, she has health problems, we're her only joy. I had heard those lines so many times they lost meaning, turned into white noise. But now, standing before all these people, I felt a strange relief. Masks were off, the truth spoken aloud. Estrella had declared openly that I didn't belong in their family. Perhaps she was right. I truly didn't belong in a family where a daughter-in-law had to be a silent servant, where a husband couldn't defend his wife, where personal boundaries didn't exist. I took a deep breath and began to speak. My voice was calm, almost detached, as if telling someone else's story. I spoke of how I had tried to be a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, tried to get along with Estrella, to please her, to earn her approval, and how, time and again, I had run into a wall of criticism and rejection. I told them how she had come into our home uninvited, rearranged our things, interfered in our decisions, how she had criticized my cooking, my clothes, my character, how she had blamed me for the loss of our child, though doctors said it was not my fault. Estrella tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand to silence her. I went on, telling how she manipulated Ramon, using his guilt and sense of duty, how she turned him against me, compared me to other women, hinted he could have found someone better, how she systematically destroyed our marriage, driving a wedge between us. Ramon sat with his head down, not looking at me or his mother, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched. I knew he heard every word, knew deep down I was right, but also knew he would never admit it, never stand against his mother. Estrella stood, her face red with rage, her perfect hair disheveled as she shook her head, rejecting my words. She began shouting about ingratitude, about how she only wanted to help, how everything she did was for the best. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had said everything I needed to say. Only one thing remained. I looked her straight in the eye and said that one phrase, short, sharp, after which the hall fell into absolute silence. Even the background music seemed to stop. Estrella opened her mouth but couldn't produce a sound. Her face turned white, then red again. She gripped the edge of the table as if her legs wouldn't hold her. The guests froze, afraid to move, afraid to break the deafening silence. Someone dropped a fork and the sound rang like thunder in the quiet. Margarita's jaw literally dropped. Ramon's grandfather began coughing, his grandmother patting his back, grateful for something to do in the unbearable pause. Alejandro was the first to recover. He stood, came over to me, placed a hand on my shoulder. That simple gesture of support shattered the invisible wall between me and the rest. Lucia also stood, taking her place on my other side. I nodded gratefully, feeling that I wasn't alone in this hall full of strangers. Ramon finally lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes held everything: pain, shame, anger, confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head. Too late. 4 years I had waited for him to speak, to defend me, to defend our marriage. But he had chosen silence, hoping problems would vanish on their own. Estrella finally found her voice, screaming that I was ungrateful, that I had ruined the celebration, shamed the family, that Ramon would be happy without me, that he would find a proper wife who appreciated what she had. I listened calmly, almost indifferently. Her words no longer held power over me. When she ran out of breath, I quietly removed my wedding ring and placed it on the table in front of Ramon. That gesture seemed to cause him physical pain. He twitched as if to grab my hand, to stop me, but he didn't. The ring lay on the white tablecloth, gleaming under the chandeliers, a simple gold band that had once symbolized eternal love and loyalty. I picked up my purse, thanked Alejandro and Lucia for their support, and walked toward the exit. Behind me came a crash. I turned to see Estrella sweeping glasses and plates from the table. Red wine spilled across the cloth like blood. Fitting, I thought. The death of what once pretended to be a family. Ramon leapt up, rushing to his mother, trying to calm her. She sobbed, clung to him, muttering. The other guests bustled about, some picking up shards, some running for water, some calling taxis. The celebration was ruined, reduced to chaos. I stepped out of the restaurant into the cool evening air. September had been warm that year, but autumn was already in the air. I paused on the steps, inhaling deeply, savoring the silence after the banquet hall's noise. I pulled out my phone and called a taxi. While waiting, I thought about what to do next. The apartment was in Ramon's name, though the down payment had come from my savings. But I wasn't going to fight for it. Too many bad memories lingered in those walls. Estrella's constant presence, her criticism, her interference. The night after the miscarriage, when I lay in an empty bedroom while Ramon comforted his mother, who cried over the grandchildren she had lost. I had savings enough to rent a place and start over, a job I loved, friends who would support me, parents who would welcome me without questions or reproach. I would manage. For the first time in 4 years, I felt free. The taxi arrived and I got in, giving the driver Teresa's address, the friend whose birthday party had first brought me and Ramon together. She had often offered to let me stay with her if things ever became unbearable. Today they had. I texted Teresa that I was on my way, that I'd explain everything in person. She replied immediately. She was waiting. The kettle was already on the stove. On the ride over, my phone kept buzzing with calls. Ramon, Estrella, unknown numbers, probably some of the guests. I muted it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. The rest would be for the lawyers to sort out. Teresa greeted me in pajamas, a glass of wine in her hand. She hugged me without asking questions, led me into the living room, sat me on the couch, covered me with a blanket. Only then did I realize I was trembling. Not from the cold, but from the tension finally releasing. She brought me tea with cognac, sat next to me, and held my hand. I told her everything. About the anniversary turned into a farce. Estrella's words, Ramon's silence, my own response. Teresa listened, sometimes shaking her head, sometimes squeezing my hand tighter. When I finished, she simply said she was proud of me, that it was long overdue to put that family in their place. Then she told me things I hadn't known. Apparently, Estrella had come to her a month earlier, trying to find out whether I was cheating on Ramon, hinting she'd pay for information. Teresa had thrown her out but hadn't told me. She hadn't wanted to upset me. Now she regretted it. She also said she had seen Ramon with a woman at a cafe a week earlier. They sat by the window, talking animatedly. The woman was young, well-groomed, in expensive clothes. Teresa hadn't thought much of it at the time, assumed she was a colleague or client. But now, after Estrella's words about having chosen a bride for her son, it all made sense. I didn't feel jealousy or betrayal, more a kind of sadness. Sadness that the man I had loved turned out so weak, unable to fight for our marriage, yet capable of meeting with a potential replacement while we were still married. Then again, perhaps it had been his mother's initiative, and he just couldn't refuse, as always. Teresa and I talked late into the night, reminiscing about the past, making plans for the future. She offered to let me stay as long as I needed. Her apartment was large, 3 rooms inherited from her grandmother, plenty of space. I agreed to a couple of weeks until I found a place of my own. In the morning, I was woken by insistent knocking at the door. Teresa went to open it. I heard muffled voices in the hallway. Then she returned with a strange look on her face. She said Ramon was there, wanting to talk. I didn't want to see him, but Teresa said he looked awful, hadn't slept all night, was begging for just 5 minutes. I came out in Teresa's borrowed robe, my hair a mess, no makeup. Ramon really did look terrible. Wrinkled suit, no tie, stubble, red eyes. He looked at me with such pain that for a moment I almost pitied him, but only for a moment. He began speaking haltingly, stumbling over words. He apologized for not defending me, for letting his mother go so far, said he loved me, couldn't imagine life without me, was ready to put his mother in her place, to limit her presence in our lives. He claimed the woman his mother had mentioned was just the daughter of her friend, a pediatrician, and that he'd only met with her because his mother insisted. Nothing had happened. Nothing ever would. I listened silently, leaning against the wall. When he finished, I asked only one thing. Why had he stayed silent the night before, when his mother humiliated me in front of everyone? Why didn't he stand up, stop her, say a word in my defense? Ramon lowered his head. He said he'd been in shock, hadn't expected that from his mother, hadn't known how to react, had feared making things worse, had hoped he could explain and apologize later, in private. I shook my head. I told him the problem wasn't one evening, but 4 years of silence, of him always choosing the path of least resistance, avoiding conflicts, hoping problems would solve themselves. But problems don't solve themselves. They pile up like a snowball until they become an avalanche, sweeping away everything in its path. Ramon tried to take my hand, but I pulled back. I said I needed time to think, that I'd contact him through a lawyer about the divorce and division of property, that I didn't want fights or scandals, just a peaceful separation so I could start over. He stood in the doorway, hesitating, as if hoping I'd change my mind and call him back, but I stayed silent. At last, he left, quietly closing the door. I went back to the room, sat on the bed, hugged my knees. Teresa brought me coffee, sat beside me, hugged me. The next days were filled with errands. I took leave from work, started looking for an apartment to rent. I found a good place near my office, a 1-bedroom but spacious, with a large kitchen and a balcony. The owner, an elderly woman, was renting it after moving in with her daughter. It was furnished simply but comfortably, clean, bright. I signed a 1-year lease with the option to extend. At the same time, I began divorce proceedings. I found a good lawyer through a colleague's recommendation. a calm, competent woman in her mid-40s with plenty of family law experience. She said that with no children and no prenuptial agreement, the divorce would go fairly quickly. Assets would be split equally. But since the apartment was in Ramon's name and the car in mine, there was little to fight over. Ramon called every day, but I didn't answer. He sent long messages I deleted without reading. He came to Teresa's, but she never let him pass the door. He sent flowers to my office, but I gave them to the secretary. I didn't feel hatred or anger toward him, just exhaustion and the desire to close this chapter of my life. Estrella also tried to reach me. At first, she called with threats, saying I'd regret ruining her son's life. Then she changed tactics, sending tearful messages about her weak heart, about not surviving her son's divorce. I blocked her number. 2 weeks after that disastrous anniversary, I received a letter from Ramon, a real letter, in an envelope delivered by courier. I held it for a long time before opening it. In the end, curiosity won. It was handwritten, in Ramon's familiar scrawl, sweeping, a little careless, slanting left. He wrote about our first meeting, how he had seen me on Teresa's balcony and couldn't look away, how it had taken him an hour to gather courage to approach me. He wrote about our first date, how he was so nervous he confused the restaurants and we spent half an hour looking for a non-existent table, how he knew he wanted to marry me when he saw me reading a book in the park, completely absorbed, oblivious to the world around me, about choosing the ring, how he went to 12 jewelry shops before finding the right one, how he rehearsed the proposal in front of a mirror, then forgot all the words and just blurted out, "Will you marry me?" He recalled our good times, the mountain trip in our second year when we got lost in the woods, and instead of panicking, had a picnic in a clearing while waiting to be found, how we learned to snowboard together and spent the day falling and laughing until we cried, how we baked a cake for my birthday and forgot it in the oven, then ate the charred edges with champagne. At the end of the letter, he wrote about his mother. Admitted she had always been controlling, used to having everything her way. After his father's death, it worsened. She was afraid of losing him too, so she clung so tightly she smothered with her love. He understood this, but didn't know how to change it without hurting her. And hurting the mother who raised him, who was left alone, he couldn't. The last paragraph said he wasn't asking forgiveness, knew he didn't deserve it. He just wanted me to know those 4 years had been the best of his life, despite everything, and that he would always remember me, even if he never saw me again. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope. No tears, no urge to reply, just sadness, that things could have been different if only Ramon had found the strength to choose our family over the comfort of avoiding conflict. At work, my colleagues tactfully asked no questions, though everyone knew about the breakup. My boss, Diego, a man in his 50s with much life experience, called me in. He said if I needed more leave or a transfer to another department as a distraction, he would help. I thanked him, but said work was the only thing keeping me afloat. And it was true. Immersing myself in editing manuscripts, working with authors, planning publications. It distracted me from the personal drama. The world of books was logical, understandable, unlike the chaos of real life. I even took on an extra project, editing the memoirs of a famous traveler, which required complete immersion. One evening, returning home from the office, I ran into Margarita, Estrella's friend, the one who had sat next to me at that disastrous party. She stood by the entrance to my building, clearly waiting. I wanted to pass by, but she blocked my way. She said she needed to talk, that it was important. Reluctantly, I agreed, but didn't invite her in. We went to a nearby cafe. She ordered coffee. I had tea. For a while, she was silent, gathering her thoughts, then began to speak. She had known Estrella since their student days. They studied at the same institute, lived in the same dormitory. Estrella was always the leader, gathering people around her, controlling them. She met Miguel, Ramon's father, in her final year. He was 10 years older, already working at a factory, a promising engineer. Estrella decided he suited her and won him, though he already had a girlfriend. After the wedding, Estrella completely bent her husband to her will, deciding where they lived, how they spent money, whom they socialized with. Miguel was gentle, conflict-averse, so he yielded. When Ramon was born, Estrella focused on him, controlling every step, choosing his friends, hobbies, even his university. Margarita told me something I hadn't known. Ramon had had a girlfriend at university, Carmen. They had dated for 2 years, planned to marry, but Estrella was against it. Carmen's family was too simple. A working-class father, a shop assistant mother, not good enough for her son. She created such a scandal, manipulated, threatened, until Ramon broke up with Carmen. The girl moved away, married, had 2 children. Ramon struggled for a long time to form relationships afterward. Then I came along. At first, Estrella was pleased. I was educated, from a respectable family, with a good job. But then she realized I wasn't as compliant as she wanted, that I had opinions of my own and wasn't afraid to voice them. And so, her quiet war against me began. Margarita fell silent, took a sip of cold coffee, then looked me in the eyes and said something that made me shiver. The daughter of another of her friends, the pediatrician Estrella had chosen for Ramon, was already pregnant. By him. Those meetings, supposedly formal at his mother's insistence, had in fact lasted several months and were far from innocent. I sat there processing. So while I was fighting for our marriage, suffering under my mother-in-law's attacks, grieving the loss of my child, my husband was seeing another woman, and she was pregnant. What hadn't worked out for us had worked out for them. The irony of fate. Margarita went on, saying Estrella was overjoyed, preparing to be a grandmother, already thinking up names. The wedding was planned for a month later, as soon as our divorce was finalized. The bride, Isabel, agreed to everything, never argued, had no opinions of her own. The perfect daughter-in-law in Estrella's eyes. I asked why she was telling me this. Margarita hesitated, then admitted she'd always thought her friend's behavior was wrong, that one shouldn't interfere in their children's lives, destroy families. But she had stayed silent, not wanting to ruin their friendship. After the anniversary, after my words, after that one phrase, she realized she couldn't stay silent anymore. She said she admired my courage, that I had found the strength to answer back, to put an end to it that many women endure for years, decades, afraid to be alone, afraid of judgment. But I had chosen myself, my freedom, my dignity. And she wanted me to know the truth so I wouldn't blame myself for the failure of the marriage. It had been doomed long before that anniversary. We parted at the cafe. Margarita wished me happiness, said she was sure I would find someone who truly valued me. I thanked her for her honesty and walked home. I walked slowly, turning it all over in my mind. Strangely, the news of Ramon's mistress's pregnancy didn't hurt. If anything, it brought relief. Now I knew for certain I had made the right decision, that our marriage had been doomed, with or without Estrella. At home, I called my parents. I had long meant to tell them about the divorce, but had put it off, unsure how to start. My mother listened silently, then said she and Dad had long sensed my unhappiness, seen it in my eyes when I visited, in my strained smile, in how I avoided talking about family life. My father took the phone. He said I could always come home, that my room was waiting. I cried for the first time in 2 weeks, tears of relief, gratitude, love for my parents, who accepted me unconditionally, without questions or reproach. The next day, I received the official divorce papers from Ramon's lawyer. He had agreed to all my terms, made no claims beyond what the law entitled him to. The car remained mine, the apartment his. No demands, no disputes. A clean, quick divorce. My lawyer said she rarely saw such cases. Usually people fought over every spoon. I signed the papers feeling an odd lightness, as if I had taken off a heavy backpack after a long hike. My shoulders straightened. My breathing eased. I was officially free. Free to build my life by my own rules, without a mother-in-law's judgment, without bending to a husband's weakness. Teresa organized a small party in honor of my freedom. She invited a few of our mutual friends, the ones who had supported me all these years. We drank wine, laughed, reminisced about our youth, made plans. One friend, Soledad, shared that she too had divorced a year earlier, after 7 years of marriage. Her husband had cheated, and she had endured it for a long time, hoping he would change. He didn't. Now she was happily single, traveling, pursuing what she loved, dating men without commitments. Another friend, Dolores, was the opposite, happily married for 10 years. But she admitted it had taken enormous work. Her mother-in-law had also tried to control their lives, but her husband had set boundaries from the very beginning. He told his mother that he loved her, but his family was him and his wife, and interference was unacceptable. It had been difficult, there had been resentment, but in the end his mother accepted it and learned to respect their boundaries. I listened to these stories and thought about how different people's lives turn out. Some are lucky to find a strong partner who protects the family. Others must protect themselves alone. And some endure forever, waiting for a miracle that never comes. A month after the divorce, I received a wedding invitation. The envelope was expensive, embossed with gold. Inside was a delicate card with monograms. Ramon and Isabel invited me to their wedding. The date, in 2 weeks. The venue, the same country estate where we had celebrated our wedding 5 years earlier. Outdoor ceremony, banquet for 150 guests. I stared at the invitation for a long time, not understanding why they had sent it. A cruel joke? A way to show me Ramon had quickly forgotten? Or Estrella's attempt to flaunt her victory? In the end, I threw the invitation into the trash. I had no desire, no need to attend that spectacle. On the day of their wedding, I went to my parents. I couldn't stay in the city knowing that somewhere Ramon was marrying another, that Estrella was celebrating with her perfect daughter-in-law. My parents met me at the station, hugged me, drove me home. The house of my childhood welcomed me with the smell of my mother's pies and my father's tobacco, which he smoked secretly in the garage. My room was almost unchanged. The same wallpaper with tiny flowers, the same desk by the window, the same bookshelf packed with beloved novels. Only the bed was new. My mother had bought it specially for my visit. I lay down, staring at the ceiling where I had once stuck glowing stars as a child. They were still there, faded but visible. That evening, we sat on the veranda, drinking tea with raspberry jam. My mother shared local news: who had married, who had divorced, who had left for the city, who had returned. My father smoked his pipe quietly, adding short comments. They didn't ask questions about my life, didn't give advice. They were simply there, and that was enough. I stayed a week, helping my mother in the garden, going fishing with my father, meeting old school friends. The small town lived its steady life, where everyone knew everyone, where news spread faster than the wind. Of course, everyone knew about my divorce, but no one asked awkward questions. They simply nodded sympathetically, wished me happiness. Back in the capital, I buried myself in work. The Traveler's Memoir project turned out more difficult than expected. The author, a man in his 60s who had traveled half the world, had hundreds of stories, but no structure. We spent hours in my office sorting through his notes and photos, building chronology, picking the best stories. His name was Guillermo, but he asked to be called Guille. Tall, sunburnt, with a gray beard and laughing eyes. He told of climbing Everest, diving to shipwrecks, months spent in the African savanna. Every story was an adventure. Every photo breathed freedom. One evening, when we had stayed late working on a chapter about the Amazon, he asked why I never smiled for real. I was surprised, said that I did. He shook his head. said mine was a polite professional smile, not the kind that came from the heart. I didn't know what to answer. He was right. Since the divorce, I had forgotten how to smile sincerely, to laugh freely. I functioned, worked, talked. But a part of me had been left behind in that banquet hall, in the moment when I spoke that phrase and walked out, leaving my past behind. Guillermo didn't press. He pulled a flask of cognac from his backpack, poured some into my cold coffee. Then he said he had a theory. People are divided into those who live and those who exist. Those who live take risks, make mistakes, fall and get up. Those who exist choose safety, stability, predictability. He asked me which I wanted to be. I thought about it. For 4 years of marriage, I had existed, adapting, enduring, hoping. Afraid of conflict, afraid of losing the little I had. And in the end, I had lost myself. Maybe it was time to start living, without looking back, without fearing the future. Work on the book progressed. We met 3 times a week, sometimes in the office, sometimes in a cafe, sometimes in the park when the weather allowed. Guillermo turned out to be not only an engaging storyteller, but also an attentive listener. Gradually, without noticing it myself, I began telling him about my childhood in a small town, about my dream of becoming a writer, about my job in publishing. A compromise between dream and reality. He asked why I didn't write myself. I said I lacked the experience, the stories worth telling. He laughed and said everyone has a story worthy of a book. Not everyone is ready to tell it honestly without embellishment or excuses. One evening, after finishing a chapter, he invited me to a photo exhibition of his friend, a documentary photographer who had captured the lives of the indigenous peoples of the Andes. I agreed, thinking it might be professional interest. Perhaps we'd find a new author. The exhibition was in a small downtown gallery. Black and white photos on white walls, soft lighting, quiet ethnic music. Old faces lined with wrinkles like maps of life lived. Children playing among rocks. Women weaving bright fabrics. Simple lives with no place for pretense or lies. The photographer Pablo was Guillermo's peer. They had met 20 years earlier on an expedition in Peru and had been friends ever since. Pablo spoke about his travels, about the people he had met, about the importance of preserving the memory of a disappearing world. The gallery was full of people. Journalists, artists, photography lovers. I stopped in front of one picture. An elderly woman in traditional dress looked straight into the camera. There was such depth, such wisdom in her eyes, it was impossible to look away. A man stopped next to me, also studying the photo. We started talking. His name was Mauricio. He was an architect like Ramon, but the similarity ended there. Mauricio specialized in restoring historic buildings, believing that preserving the past mattered more than building the new. We talked the whole evening, moving from one photograph to another, discussing, debating, agreeing. He was 5 years older than me, divorced, no children. He had divorced 3 years earlier. His wife left him for another. At first he went through self-destruction, alcohol, sleepless nights, trying to revive what was already dead. Then acceptance, recovery, a new life. Now he was grateful to his ex-wife for finding the courage to leave instead of turning their life into hell. We exchanged numbers, agreed to meet for coffee. It wasn't a date, just 2 people enjoying conversation. At least that's what I told myself. But when I told Teresa, she smiled and said she was glad I was beginning to thaw. Meeting Mauricio was easy. We sat in a small cafe, talked about work, books, travel. He told me about restoring an old estate outside the city, about the difficulties of working with historic buildings, about the joy of returning a house to its original state. I told him about editing, about turning raw text into a book, about the joy of holding the finished work in my hands. We began meeting once a week, then twice, then more often. We went to exhibitions, to the theater, just walked around the city. Mauricio showed me the buildings he had restored, told their stories. The house of a wealthy 19th century merchant, now a museum. A 20th century residential building turned into luxury apartments. A wooden mansion miraculously preserved among modern towers. He never rushed things, never pressured me, never asked for more than I was ready to give. We were friends who might become more, but for now simply enjoyed each other's company, without obligations or promises. One evening, 3 months after we met, we were walking along the embankment. Mid-autumn, the leaves burned gold and crimson, the river reflected the sunset sky. Mauricio took my hand and I didn't pull away. We walked in silence, and it was a comfortable silence, not one needing to be filled. At my building, he stopped, turned to me, and said he wanted to be honest, that he liked me, really liked me. But he knew I wasn't ready for a new relationship, that I needed time, and he was willing to wait as long as it took, or stay a friend if I couldn't see us together. I looked at his open face, his kind eyes, and felt something warm inside. Not love, not passion, but something good, right? I told him I wanted to be honest, too, that I liked him, but I was afraid of repeating past mistakes, afraid of trusting and being betrayed again. Mauricio nodded, said he understood, suggested we not make predictions, just live in the present, spend time together when we wanted, be apart when we needed solitude. No labels, no statuses, no obligations. Just two adults enjoying being together. And so we lived for the next few months, meeting when we wanted, not meeting when we didn't. Mauricio didn't introduce me to his parents. I didn't introduce him to mine. We lived in a bubble of the present, making no plans, giving no promises. Work on Guillermo's book was nearing completion. We had selected the stories, built the structure, edited the text. Only the preface and afterword remained. At our last meeting, he gave me a plane ticket, one way to the city on Lake Titicaca where his first major expedition had begun. He said I had spent too long merely existing. It was time to start living. That traveling alone was the best way to discover who you really are, what you want, where you're going. The ticket was for the next month. I could change the date or get a refund, but he hoped I would go. I held the ticket, feeling both fear and excitement. I had never traveled alone, always with parents, friends, or my husband. The idea of getting on a plane into the unknown was both terrifying and irresistible. That evening, I told Mauricio about Guillermo's gift. I expected him to dissuade me, to talk about the dangers of solo travel, but he smiled, said it was a great idea, that everyone should once in their life be alone with themselves and the world, that he had traveled like that after his divorce, and it had helped him understand a lot. I asked if he would mind me leaving for a month. He laughed, reminded me of our agreement. No obligations, no restrictions. If I wanted to go, I should go. He would wait if I chose to return, and if not, he would be grateful for the time we'd shared. A week before departure, I received a letter from Ramon's lawyer. Ramon and Isabel had had a son. They named him Miguel after his grandfather. Estrella, now a delighted grandmother, renounced all claims to joint property and asked not to be disturbed again. A photograph was enclosed. Ramon holding the baby, Isabel beside him, pale after childbirth, but smiling. Estrella, radiant, rested her hand on her son's shoulder. I studied the photo for a long time, searching for pain, jealousy, regret, but found none. Only a faint sadness for what might have been, and relief that I wasn't in Isabel's place, that I wasn't the one bringing an heir into the world under Estrella's constant control. I showed Teresa. She studied Isabel and said, "She has dead eyes. The smile doesn't reach them. She looks like a beautiful doll, dressed up and put on display. Maybe Teresa was right. Or maybe Isabel was just tired from giving birth. In any case, it was no longer my story." I began preparing for the trip, bought a backpack, good shoes, warm clothes. Guillermo had said Titicaca in November was chilly but beautiful. The water, dark blue, almost black, reflecting the high sky. Few tourists, a chance to be alone with nature and myself. My parents understood. My mother worried a little, but my father said it was the right thing. That after everything, I needed time and space to figure out where to go next. They took me to the airport, hugged me, wished me a good journey. On the plane, I sat by the window, watching clouds below. I thought of how a year ago at this time I had been preparing for another wedding anniversary, buying Ramon a gift, planning a romantic evening, hoping Estrella wouldn't ruin it. How far away it all seemed now, like another life, lived by another person. The plane began to descend. Below, Lake Titicaca appeared, vast, majestic, indifferent to human dramas. I pressed my forehead to the window, studying the shoreline, the islands, the mountains on the horizon. Somewhere down there, new meetings, new stories, new discoveries awaited me. And maybe, at last, I would find the answer to the question that had haunted me all these months. Who am I without the role of wife, daughter-in-law, victim? Who am I on my own? Puno greeted me with piercing wind and a high blue sky. I took a taxi to a small hotel by the lake that Guillermo had recommended, an old stone building converted into a guest house, just 8 rooms. The hostess, a woman in her 50s with a kind face and quick movements, welcomed me like an old friend. Guillermo had told her I was coming, asked her to look after me. They gave me a corner room overlooking the lake. Simple furnishings, wooden furniture, a map of Titicaca and its surroundings on the wall. I sat on the bed, looking around. For the first time in a long while, I was completely alone, in an unfamiliar place, with no plan or purpose, except simply to be. The first days I just wandered around the city. Puno turned out to be a surprising mix of old and new, colonial-era buildings standing next to modern constructions. I took photos of the details that caught my eye: ornate carvings on doors, faded old signs, faces of passers-by. On the 3rd day, I decided to go to the islands. I boarded a boat to the floating Uros Islands, rocking on the waves for an hour, listening to the conversations of the locals. They spoke about fishing, about prices, about how there were almost no tourists this time of year. It meant they could work in peace. Lake Titicaca revealed itself in all its majesty once the boat left the bay. Dark blue water stretching to the horizon, the high sky above, the reflection of mountains shimmering on the surface. I sat at the edge of the boat, staring at the endless water, and for the first time in a year, I felt I could breathe fully again. On the islands, I rented a small house from an elderly couple. They usually rented rooms to tourists in summer, but in autumn there were none. They were glad to have a guest and offered a good price for a month. The house stood right by the water, the window opening onto the lake. I decided to stay. Days passed peacefully. In the mornings, I went down to the water, walked along reed paths, talked with locals. During the day, I wrote in the journal I had started on the first day of my trip. In the evenings, I drank tea with my hosts, listening to their stories of life on the lake. The husband was Juan, a lifelong fisherman retired 5 years ago. His wife, Rosita, wove bright blankets and clothing. They had 3 grown children, all living in big cities now, leaving the 2 of them alone. But they didn't complain. They said the lake never let go. Anyone who had once lived on its shores always came back. They told me legends about the lake, about shamans who still performed rituals on the island of the sun, about spirits living in the waters. Rosita believed in all of it. Juan chuckled but didn't deny that Titicaca was a special place where inexplicable things happened. After a week on the islands, something happened that changed the course of my journey. I had wandered farther than usual, about 2 kilometers from the settlement. The shore grew wild, thick with reeds, the path nearly gone. I was about to turn back when I saw a woman sitting on a large stone by the water. She wasn't young, around 60, dressed simply, her long gray hair braided. She was sketching in a notebook, completely absorbed in it. I wanted to pass quietly, but she looked up, smiled, greeted me. We started talking. Her name was Consuelo, an artist from Barcelona. She had been coming to Titicaca every autumn for 15 years, renting a cottage in a nearby village, sketching studies, preparing for her exhibitions. She showed me her drawings, the lake in different moods, at different times of day. It was astonishing how she captured the character of water, sky, and mountains with just a pencil. We began meeting almost daily at the same spot. She drew, I sat beside her. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we were silent. Consuelo told me her story. She had been married, had a daughter, lived the life of a cultured Barcelonan. At 45, her husband left her for a younger woman. Her daughter moved abroad to study and stayed there. She was left alone in a big apartment with a successful career as an illustrator of children's books, but with the feeling her life was over. Depression, therapy, antidepressants. And then a friend dragged her on a trip to Titicaca. Something shifted here. She began drawing not for clients, but for herself. She returned to Barcelona a different person. Now she lived between Barcelona and Titicaca, half the year in the city. Exhibitions, teaching at an art school, visits with her daughter and grandchildren. Half the year here, on the shore, alone with nature and her art. She said it was the perfect balance between social life and solitude. She asked about my story. I told her, briefly, of a failed marriage, divorce, the attempt to figure out what came next. Consuelo nodded, said she recognized herself 15 years earlier. The same searching, the same confusion, the same sense that the old life was over while the new one hadn't begun yet. She suggested I try drawing. I refused, said I couldn't, that I'd always been bad at it in school. She laughed, said skill didn't matter, only the process. Drawing was meditation, a way to sink into the moment, to silence the chattering mind. The next day, she brought me another sketchbook and pencils, showed me the basics, how to hold the pencil, how to see light and shadow, how to convey volume. She told me to draw whatever I wanted, however I wanted, with no judgment or criticism. Just move the pencil across the page and see what happens. My first drawings were awful. Crooked lines, disproportionate rocks, water that looked like a fence. But something about the process hooked me. Complete focus on what was in front of me, the attempt to transfer it to paper, forgetting everything else. I drew every day, filling page after page. After 2 weeks, Mauricio called. He asked how I was, where I was, when I planned to return. I told him about the islands, about Consuelo, about drawing. He was glad I had found something to occupy me. Said he missed me, but didn't pressure. He just wanted to hear my voice. We talked half an hour about nothing in particular, and I caught myself smiling. A week later, a message from Teresa. She wrote that she had run into Ramon at the mall. He was with his wife and child, shopping for baby things. He looked tired, older, though only a year had passed since our divorce. Isabel gave orders telling him what to buy and what not to. Estrella walked beside them, giving advice, criticizing her daughter-in-law's choices. Ramon silently pushed the stroller. Teresa wrote that he noticed her, wanted to come over, but Estrella said something sharp, and he turned away, pretending not to see her. Teresa added that I had escaped that hell just in time, that Ramon got exactly what he deserved, a perfect wife for his mother and total control over his life. I reread the message several times, trying to name what I felt. Pity, schadenfreude, relief, probably a little of everything, but above all, gratitude that I was no longer part of that life, that instead I was sitting by Titicaca, sketching crooked waves, drinking tea with new friends, feeling alive. Consuelo once said that everyone has turning points in life, moments when you can choose the familiar, safe but lifeless path, or the unknown, frightening but alive one. Most choose the first and regret it forever. A few take the risk and either win or at least end up with an interesting story. I thought of those words, remembering that anniversary, that moment standing before all the guests, before my triumphant mother-in-law, before my silent husband. I could have stayed quiet, swallowed the humiliation, preserved the image of a family. Many would have, but I chose to speak the truth. The words that destroyed everything and at the same time set me free. At the end of my 3rd week on Titicaca, I received an unexpected letter from Guillermo. He wrote that his book was ready for print, the publisher planned a launch, and he wanted me there as editor. But he added that he would understand if I wasn't ready to return, that the journey mattered more. The decision was mine. I showed the letter to Consuelo. She read it, gave me back my phone, and asked what I wanted to do. Not what I should do, not what others expected, but what I wanted. The question startled me. For years, I had grown so used to duty, obligations, expectations, that I had forgotten to ask myself what I desired. I closed my eyes, listened inward. Did I want to return to the capital? Yes and no. Yes, because my work was there, which I loved, my friends whom I missed, Mauricio, with whom I wanted to continue what had begun. No, because here I had finally begun to hear myself, to understand who I was without roles and masks. Consuelo suggested a compromise, return for the presentation, spend a couple of weeks in the city, then decide. Titicaca wasn't going anywhere, it would wait, and so would Juan and Rosita's cottage. I agreed, bought a plane ticket for 3 days later. The last days on Titicaca were special. I visited all my favorite places, saying goodbye, but not forever. Consuelo gave me a set of pencils and a new notebook. She told me to keep drawing wherever I was, that it was now part of me, a way of seeing the world differently. On my final evening, Juan and Rosita prepared a farewell dinner. Fish by a special recipe, fresh flatbreads, homemade herbal liqueur. We sat in their small kitchen, talking about life, the lake, how everything changes but something always remains. Rosita told me how she and Juan had nearly divorced after 20 years of marriage. The children had grown up and left. They were left alone and realized they had become strangers. They lived like polite neighbors, but without warmth. They thought of separating but decided to give themselves a year. They came here, to Titicaca, rented a cottage, spent the summer together without children, without work, without routine. And something happened. They rediscovered each other, remembered why they fell in love, found new points of connection. They returned home different people, with a different marriage. Not perfect, but alive, real. Now, 15 years later, they couldn't imagine life apart. I listened and thought that not all marriages are meant to be saved. Sometimes people just don't fit, no matter how hard they try, and it's more honest to admit it and part ways than to torture each other for years. Ramon and I hadn't fit. He needed a woman who would follow him, accept his weaknesses, endure his mother. I needed a man who would stand beside me, not behind his mother, someone who could protect our family from outside interference. In the morning, Juan drove me to the airport. We rode in silence, and only at parting did he say the lake would remember me and wait for me. Maybe in a year, maybe in 10, but I would return. The plane took off, and I watched the lake recede through the window, vast, majestic, indifferent to human fuss. A month earlier, I had arrived broken, lost, unsure how to go on. I was leaving another person, not fully healed, but beginning to heal. Not with all the answers, but finally asking the right questions. The capital welcomed me with November warmth and noise. From the airport, I went straight home, to my rented apartment. A month's worth of mail piled up, flowers wilted on the windowsill, forgotten before I left. The apartment felt foreign, too neat, too urban after the simplicity of my cottage on Titicaca. I showered, changed, and called Teresa. She was thrilled, said she had missed me terribly, demanded to see me immediately. We arranged to meet that evening. She promised to bring wine and ready-made food so we wouldn't waste time cooking. Then I called work, said I was back and could return in a couple of days. Diego said he was glad, that there was a special project waiting for me. The memoirs of a famous actress, needing a delicate editor who could handle a complicated author. I wrote Mauricio a short message, that I was back and would like to meet if he wanted. He replied in 5 minutes, first a smiley, then asking if I was free the next evening. I said yes. He suggested our favorite cafe where we used to sit before my trip. That evening, Teresa came with 2 bottles of wine and bags of food from my favorite restaurant. We sat in the kitchen, and I told her about Titicaca, about Consuelo, about drawing, about Juan and Rosita, showed her photos, my sketches, less awful with each day. Teresa listened, sometimes asked questions, laughed at my first attempts to draw waves. Then she told me the city's news. One friend had married, another divorced, a third had twins. At her office, a new boss, young, ambitious, feared by all. She was thinking of changing jobs but hadn't decided. Toward the end of the evening, finishing the second bottle, Teresa suddenly looked at me seriously. "You've changed. Not on the outside, though the tan and the weight loss are noticeable. Inside, there's a calmness now that wasn't there before, as if you finally stopped running and looking back." I thought about her words. Maybe she was right. A month at Titicaca had taught me to be in the moment, not to cling to the past, not to fear the future, just to be here and now, with what is. It didn't solve all problems, but gave me a tool to face them. The next day, I met Mauricio. He was waiting at our usual table by the window. He stood up when I entered, hugged me, but didn't try to kiss me. We sat across from each other, just looking, reacquainting ourselves. He looked well, a little tired, but content. He told me the estate restoration project was nearing completion, the museum's grand opening soon. He invited me, if I wanted to come. I agreed. Then I told him about my trip, showed photos. Mauricio studied my drawings, said they had something special, something genuine. We sat for 3 hours talking about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, films we'd watched, news everyone was discussing. We didn't talk about us, about what we were, where we were going. We just enjoyed each other's company. Walking me home, Mauricio took my hand. "I'm glad you're back. But I feel like you're not fully back. Part of you is still there, at Titicaca." I was surprised by his perceptiveness. He smiled. "I know because I went through the same. After my divorce, I spent 2 months in Greece, living on a small island restoring an old church. Part of me is still there. That's normal. We're made of all the places we've been, all the people we've met, all the stories we've lived. And we don't need to return completely to who we were. We need to integrate the new, to become wider, deeper, more multifaceted." At the entrance, he kissed me on the cheek. "I'd like us to keep seeing each other, but at whatever pace is comfortable for you. No rush, no pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people curious to explore life together." Guillermo's book launch was scheduled for Friday, a big bookstore downtown with invited journalists, friends, and fans of the author. I arrived an hour early helping with the setup, checking microphones, arranging books. Guillermo looked elegant in a dark suit, but I could tell he was nervous. It was his first major book, the culmination of a traveler's life. He came over, thanked me for my work, asked about my trip to Titicaca. I gave a brief reply, promised to tell him more after the event. The hall filled with people, journalists from major outlets, travel bloggers, lovers of good stories. I stood to the side watching Guillermo speak about the book, answer questions, sign copies. He was in his element, a charismatic storyteller, holding the room with ease. After the formal part came a reception. I mingled with colleagues, authors, journalists. Everyone praised the book, calling it the best thing the publishing house had released that year. Diego came up to me, said he was proud of me, that without my work, the book wouldn't have been so cohesive and strong. At the end of the evening, Guillermo pulled me aside. He said he wanted to propose a new project. His friend, the photographer Pablo, the same one from the exhibition, was planning to publish a photo album with texts about traveling in Latin America. He needed an editor who understood visual art and could work with text. Guillermo had recommended me. I agreed without hesitation. The project sounded fascinating, and working with Pablo promised to be exciting. We arranged to meet the following week to discuss details. Guillermo smiled. "I'm glad to see you like this, alive, engaged, open to the new." On the way home, I thought about how much my life had changed in the past year, from an unhappy wife, crushed by a domineering mother-in-law and a weak husband, to a free woman building her life on her own terms. The path had been painful, through public humiliation, divorce, loneliness, but it had brought me to myself. That night, I had a dream. I was back in that banquet hall on that ill-fated anniversary. Estrella was giving her speech. Ramon was silent, the guests watching. But now I saw the scene from the outside, detached. I saw myself standing, speaking those words, and instead of pain, I felt gratitude to that woman who had found the strength to speak the truth. Because of her, I had become who I was now. 2 more months passed. Winter settled in. The city sparkled with holiday lights. I worked on Pablo's project, selecting photographs, editing texts. The book was shaping into something special. Mauricio and I kept seeing each other, our relationship developing slowly but steadily. There wasn't the passion I'd once had with Ramon, but something deeper, calmer, more reliable. In mid-January, I got a call from a notary's office. A woman's voice informed me I had been listed among the heirs of one Margarita Ferrer. Surprised, I said there must be a mistake. I didn't know any Margarita Ferrer. Then I remembered. She was Estrella's friend, the one who had sat next to me at the anniversary dinner, the one who later met me and revealed the truth about Ramon and Isabel. I went to the notary's office. An elderly notary with a tired face handed me an envelope. He said Margarita had died a month earlier of a stroke, leaving several letters and small sums of money to different people. To me, a letter and $500. I opened the envelope at home. Margarita wrote that she had long wondered whether to send the letter, but decided I had the right to know. She had been present the day before our anniversary, when Estrella spoke to Ramon. She had instructed him how to behave, what to say, how to react. Everything had been staged. The public humiliation, Ramon's silence, even the seating arrangement chosen so everyone could see my face. But that wasn't all. Margarita wrote that Estrella had once slipped something into my food during the 3rd year of my marriage, when I was pregnant, herbs that could provoke a miscarriage. Margarita wasn't completely sure, but she had overheard Estrella consulting some healer about how to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy. I sat with the letter trembling, not from anger, but from the realization of the depth of malice this woman was capable of. She hadn't merely disliked me, she had actively destroyed my life, killed my unborn child. And Ramon, even if he hadn't known about the herbs, had known about his mother's plan to humiliate me publicly, and stayed silent. Margarita wrote that her conscience tormented her, that she had lost a child herself years earlier, and knew that pain. She asked forgiveness for not speaking sooner, for her silence born of fear of Estrella's influence and revenge. She ended the letter by saying she admired my courage, that the words I had spoken that night had made her rethink her entire life and the compromises she had made, that in her final months she had begun to live honestly, cutting toxic ties, reconciling with her daughter after 10 years of estrangement. I showed the letter to Mauricio. He read it, was silent for a long while, then embraced me. said he would understand if I sought justice, through court, through an investigation, but he would also understand if I chose to leave it in the past, not to reopen wounds. I thought for several days, consulted my lawyer. Could Estrella be prosecuted after so long? The lawyer said chances were minimal. Margarita's letter was not proof, only hearsay. No witnesses, no evidence. In the end, I decided not to pursue it legally, not out of nobility, but because it would drag me back into the past, force me to relive pain, anger, hatred. And I had only just begun to heal, to build a new life. I didn't want to waste my strength on revenge, but I did write to Ramon. Short, without emotion. I forwarded a copy of Margarita's letter, wrote that he needed to know who his son was living with, that Estrella was capable of anything for control, even killing her unborn grandchild, that it was now his responsibility to protect his new family or become complicit. I expected no reply and got none. But a week later, Teresa told me she had heard from acquaintances. Ramon, his wife and child, had moved to another city. He had taken a new position in the company's branch office, with an official apartment. Estrella was left behind in the capital, alone. There were rumors of a huge scandal, of her threatening to disinherit him. But for the first time in his life, Ramon had not yielded. I don't know if my letter was the cause, or just the final straw. Maybe Isabel, too, had grown tired of her mother-in-law's control. Maybe fatherhood had awakened in Ramon a protective instinct. Either way, he had done what he hadn't done for me, chosen his family over his mother. February brought unexpected news. Diego offered me a new position, head editor of a new division, memoirs and biographies, my own team, my own budget, the freedom to choose projects. It was recognition of my work, my professionalism. I accepted without hesitation. Mauricio celebrated my promotion with a romantic dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city lights. Afterward, as we stood on the terrace, he told me he was in love with me. He didn't demand an answer, didn't expect reciprocity, just wanted me to know that he was willing to wait as long as needed or remain a friend if I couldn't see us as a couple. I looked at the city lights below, remembering how a year earlier I had stood on another terrace in another dress, with another man. Back then, I thought I was happy, thought I had everything I needed. A husband, a home, a job. Only a child was missing, but I believed it was just a matter of time. Now I had no husband, no home of my own, no child. Yet strangely, I felt more whole, more truly happy than then. I had work I loved and excelled at, friends who had supported me through the hardest times, new passions like drawing, which I still practiced, and Mauricio, who never asked me to be someone else, who accepted me as I was. I turned to him and said I was falling in love too, slowly, cautiously, but falling. That I was afraid of repeating past mistakes, afraid of trusting and being betrayed again. But I was willing to try, if he was ready for the fact that it wouldn't be easy, that I carried scars still tender. Mauricio smiled. I have scars too. There are no perfect people, no perfect relationships. There are just two imperfect people choosing to be imperfect together, to learn, to grow, to support each other. He kissed me, and for the first time in a long while, I kissed back, without fear or doubt. March began with an unexpected encounter. Walking down the street after a meeting, I saw them, Estrella and another woman, sitting in a cafe by the window. My mother-in-law looked older, shrunken. Her expensive clothes couldn't hide the fatigue, the loneliness. The woman opposite her spoke animatedly. Estrella nodded, but her gaze was empty. I could have walked past, pretended not to see. But something made me stop, go inside. Not revenge, not curiosity. More a need to place a final period at the end of this chapter. Estrella noticed me as I approached. Her face flickered with emotions: surprise, fear, anger, something like shame. Her companion looked at me curiously. I greeted her calmly, politely. Estrella replied uncertainly, clearly unsure what to expect: a scene, accusations. But I simply asked how she was, how her health was. She answered shortly that all was well, though it clearly wasn't. Then I said what I had come to say, that I bore her no grudge, that I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. That carrying hatred was too heavy a burden, and I had chosen to set it down, that I wished her peace, and maybe one day the ability to love not by suffocating and controlling, but by letting go and trusting. Estrella looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw tears in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head. No need for words, excuses, apologies. Everything had already been said and done. I turned and walked out of the cafe, feeling an unfamiliar lightness. The last thread binding me to the past was cut. That year, spring came early. By late March, the air was warm, the trees in bloom. I moved into a new apartment, my own, bought with savings and a bonus for successful projects. Small but bright, overlooking a park. Mauricio helped me move. We chose furniture together, argued over wall colors, laughed at failed attempts to assemble a wardrobe from instructions. In April, exactly a year after that ill-fated anniversary, I received an invitation. A thick envelope, a card embossed with gold inside. Alejandro and Lucia, our friends who had stood by me that night, invited us to their 10th wedding anniversary. I smiled, thinking how differently lives unfold. Their marriage had endured. Mine had fallen apart. The celebration was full of people. Some I knew, others I met for the first time. Alejandro and Lucia glowed with happiness, their 2 boys running between tables. I came with Mauricio, introduced him to my friends. They were glad for me, said they were happy to see me content. Midway through the evening, Lucia asked for attention. She said she wanted to share the secret of their strong marriage, that it hadn't always been easy, that there were crises, moments when it seemed easier to separate. But they had learned the most important thing: to speak honestly with each other, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, to protect their family from outside interference, and to remember why they had chosen one another. Then she looked at me and said she wanted to thank me for the lesson in courage I had given a year ago, for showing how vital it was to stand up for yourself and your dignity. She said that after that evening, she and Alejandro had talked a lot, rethought their relationship, learned to cherish what they had. I hadn't expected that. Embarrassed, I lowered my eyes, but Alejandro raised his glass, proposed a toast to truth, the kind that frees, even if it hurts at first. Everyone lifted their glasses, and I felt tears roll down my cheeks, not of sorrow, but of a profound release. After the party, Mauricio and I walked through the night city. He held my hand, sometimes kissed my temple. We reached the riverfront, sat on a bench, gazed at the dark water. Mauricio asked what I was thinking about. I said, about time. How a year ago my life had collapsed and now had come together again in a new shape, but one that felt right. He asked if I regretted anything. I thought, did I regret 4 years of marriage to Ramon? The lost child? The pain I had endured? No, probably not. All of it had made me who I was, taught me to value myself, to defend my boundaries, to choose the right people to stand beside me. In May, I went back to Titicaca, alone, as I had the first time. Juan and Rosita welcomed me like family, said they had been waiting. Consuelo was there too, preparing a new exhibition. We met again on the shore, drew, talked, sat in silence. She said she saw great change in me, that I had found my path. I spent 2 weeks at Titicaca, drawing, walking, thinking about the past, the present, the future. about how one decision, one phrase spoken at the right moment can change an entire life, about how sometimes everything must be torn down to the ground in order to be rebuilt, stronger, truer. When I returned to the city, Maurizio was waiting at my door with an enormous bouquet of flowers. He said he had missed me desperately, that 2 weeks without me had felt like an eternity, that he had realized he wanted to wake up with me every morning and fall asleep beside me every night. Not a marriage proposal. It was still too soon, but a proposal to try living together, carefully, day by day. I agreed. We started with weekends, then he stayed for a week, and eventually he just moved in. Without fanfare, without vows of eternal love, just two adults deciding to share space and time. We learned from each other, sometimes argued, reconciled, found compromises. In August, something happened that finally closed the story of my first marriage. My phone rang from an unfamiliar number and I answered automatically. It was Ramon. His voice was tired, hollow. He said he needed to see me, to talk, that it was important. I agreed, setting a meeting at a cafe downtown, neutral ground. He arrived on time. He looked very different, thinner, gray-haired, his wrinkles deeper. We sat at a table, ordered coffee. For a while, we stayed silent, unsure where to begin. At last, he spoke. He said he had read Margarita's letter, that at first he couldn't believe it. But then he started remembering, connecting the dots, and he realized the signs had been there all along. He had simply refused to see them. The strange bruise his mother made for health. Her barely concealed joy when I lost the baby. He said he had confronted her, demanded the truth. At first she denied it, but eventually she admitted, "I did it for your own good. She wasn't right for our family. A child would have tied you to the wrong woman. Isabel is different. The right wife who gave you the right heir." Ramon said that after that conversation, he could no longer look at his mother. Their move to another city had been an attempt to escape her, the truth, his own guilt. But distance didn't help. Isabel was miserable, not as compliant as she had seemed. Tired of pretending to be perfect, she wanted her own life. They were on the verge of divorce. He had come to ask for forgiveness, for his silence, for his cowardice, for not protecting me, for not protecting our child. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, knew he didn't deserve it. He only wanted me to know how deeply he regretted everything, how much he wished he could change the past. I listened, and instead of anger, I felt only exhaustion. Too late for apologies, too late for regret. What was done was done. I told him as much, that I bore no hatred, but I could not forgive. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a process, and maybe one day it would come. I told him he needed to forgive himself, to learn to live with guilt without letting it destroy his present, that he had a son who needed a father, a wife with whom he must either repair things honestly or part honestly. His responsibility now was to them, not to me. We parted outside the cafe. Ramon extended his hand for a handshake. I shook it, a strange gesture for former spouses, but fitting for two strangers now. He walked away hunched, and I knew I would never see him again. And that was as it should be. At home, Maurizio was waiting with dinner. He didn't ask about the meeting, just hugged me, said he was proud of me. We ate, then sat on the balcony with wine, watching the sunset, talking about vacation plans, about redecorating the bedroom, about adopting a cat. Ordinary conversations of an ordinary couple building a shared life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the strangeness of life, about the woman who had walked down the aisle 4 years ago, full of hope, about the one who had stood in the banquet hall a year ago, humiliated, betrayed, about the one who had found the strength to answer back. And suddenly, I realized it was time to tell the story to the end, to write down the phrase I had spoken that night, the one that changed everything. Why it had such power, why it silenced the entire hall, why it became the turning point of my life. September came again, bringing the anniversary of that day. A year and a half had passed since that fateful evening. Mauricio suggested a weekend away to avoid the date, but I refused. I wanted to spend the day at home quietly reflecting. In the morning, I woke early, made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened the notebook Consuelo had given me. I began to write, not to draw, but to write the story of the woman I had been, of marriage, collapse, rebirth. I wrote all day, pausing only for tea or to stretch. Mauricio kept quietly busy, giving me space. By evening, I reached that moment, the banquet hall, Estrella's speech, my silent husband. I closed my eyes, relived every detail, the white tablecloth stained with wine, the guests' faces hungry for drama, Estrella's triumphant gaze, Ramon's bowed head, and myself standing in the middle of it all, utterly calm. The phrase had come from deep inside, from the place where 4 years of unspoken truth had been stored. I hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed. It simply burst out, sharp as a blade. I looked at Estrella and said, "Do you know why your husband died? He fled into death because it was easier than living with you. That was all. One sentence. Cruel. Perhaps unfair. Miguel had died of a heart attack. No one was to blame. But I knew it was Estrella's deepest wound, her secret fear that her husband hadn't endured her pressure, her control, her demands, that she had smothered him with her love, just as she had smothered her son, just as she had tried to smother me. The hall had frozen, not in shock at cruelty, but in recognition of truth, a truth everyone had seen but no one had dared to say aloud, that Estrella was a toxic, destructive force in the lives of those she claimed to love, that her husband had preferred death to living with her, that her son had become a puppet, that her daughter-in-law was on the edge of madness under her interference. The phrase had not been about me, not about my marriage. It had been about her fears, the price of her love. And she understood. Everyone understood. Even those who didn't know the details sensed that a terrible truth had been spoken. I wrote the scene down, set my pen aside. Outside it was already dark. Mauricio brought me dinner at the desk, kissed the top of my head, asked if I had finished. I nodded. Finished. Not just the text, but an entire chapter of life. I had spoken it, written it, released it. He read what I had written, was silent for a long time, then said he understood why the phrase had such power. It was like a scalpel lancing a wound, releasing the poison that had been festering for years. Cruel, but necessary. That night I slept soundly, dreamless. And in the morning I woke with the sense that I could do anything, that no barrier was too high, no truth too heavy, no life too daunting to live. A month later, I learned I was pregnant. The test showed 2 lines the doctor confirmed. 6 weeks. Sitting in the gynecologist's office, holding the ultrasound results, I cried. Not from fear or sadness, but from a deep joy. Life had given me a second chance. Mauricio received the news with tears in his eyes. He spun me around the room, kissed my belly, said it was a miracle, that he was the happiest man alive. We called our parents, our friends, shared the joy. Everyone rejoiced for us. The pregnancy was peaceful. No sickness, no complications. I kept working, kept leading projects. Mauricio and I attended parenting classes, chose names, prepared the nursery. He came to every ultrasound, every appointment. In February, I traveled to Titicaca one last time before the birth. I wanted to say goodbye to the place that had given me strength to start anew. Consuelo met me, hugged me, said I was glowing. We sat by the shore, looking at the dark waters. She said my story was proof that out of destruction, new life can be born, literally. In April, exactly 2 years after that anniversary, I gave birth to a daughter. The birth was hard, but I endured. When they laid her on my chest, small, red, crying, I felt the circle close. The life I had lost had returned in a new form. We named her Esperanza. Mauricio said the name was symbolic. Hope for the future. Faith that after the darkest night comes the dawn. I agreed. Esperanza became the anchor of our new family, the center around which our life turned. When she was a month old, I received a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, no return address. Inside, a short note. Thank you for the truth. It freed not only you, e.g., Estrella Gomez. I stared at those lines, wondering what she meant. Perhaps my cruel phrase had forced her to reflect on her life, the cost of her control. Perhaps she too had begun to change, to let go, to learn to live differently. Or perhaps they were just words, a bid for forgiveness. I didn't reply. There was no need. Everyone walks their own path, draws their own conclusions. Hers no longer crossed mine. I had my own life, my own family, my own joys and worries. Another year passed. Esperanza took her first steps, spoke her first word, Mama. Mauricio wept with joy, filmed everything. I watched them, my daughter, stumbling forward, and the man who had become a true father, though not by blood, and knew this was happiness, not perfect, not fairy tale, but real. Work thrived. I released several bestsellers. Guillermo's memoirs won a literary award. Pablo's photo album became the event of the year. My name was known in publishing circles. Authors wanted to work with me. Mauricio completed the restoration of an 18th century estate. The opening was grand. Ministers, journalists, patrons all attended. He stood on stage, speaking about the project, and I sat in the audience with Esperanza in my arms, proud. My man, who didn't just talk, but did. On the 3rd anniversary of the night my old life ended, we held a celebration, not of loss, but of rebirth. We invited friends who had supported me all along. Teresa, always by my side. Alejandro and Lucia, who had shown what true friendship was. Guillermo, who had nudged me toward the journey that changed everything. Even Consuelo came from Titicaca. We gathered in our apartment, now larger after buying and joining the next-door flat. We drank wine, ate Mauricio's paella, laughed at Esperanza smearing food across the table. An ordinary evening with ordinary people, but to me it was the symbol of victory. Not victory over Estrella or Ramon, victory over my former self, the one who endured, kept silent, hoped for a miracle, the one who feared conflict, feared being alone, feared being herself. That woman had died in the banquet hall when I spoke that phrase, and in her place was born another, one unafraid of truth, however harsh, one who knew how to guard her boundaries, to choose her people, to build her life by her own rules, one who knew that sometimes you must destroy everything in order to rebuild it better. Late at night, after the guests left and Esperanza was asleep, Mauricio and I sat on the balcony. He held me as we looked at the city lights. He asked if I ever wondered how life might have been if I had stayed silent that night, swallowed the humiliation, preserved the marriage. I thought, perhaps I would still be with Ramon, enduring Estrella. Perhaps I would have had children raised under her rule, grown bitter, grown smaller, turned into a shadow of myself. Or perhaps I would have broken completely. No, I didn't regret it. That phrase, cruel, truthful, had been necessary. It had destroyed the illusion of a family that had never truly existed. It had freed not only me, but Ramon, who finally found the strength to leave his mother. Perhaps even Estrella, though that was no longer my story. I turned to Mauricio, kissed him. I'm grateful to fate for that day, for that phrase, for all the pain I had to endure, because it led me here, to this moment, where I am completely happy. Not perfectly happy, but truly happy. He smiled. I'm grateful to Estrella too, strange as it sounds. If not for her, we never would have met. You would have stayed a married woman, unreachable. Her cruelty brought you to me. We laughed at the irony of fate. The evil people do sometimes turns into good. Destruction becomes the foundation for creation. The death of the old gives life to the new. I stood to go to bed. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day, work, childcare, chores. But I looked forward to it with joy, because it was my day in my life built with my own hands. And it had all begun with a single phrase spoken 3 years ago. Do you know why your husband died? He fled into death because it was easier than living with you. Cruel? Yes. Fair? Perhaps not. Necessary? Absolutely. Because sometimes only cruel truth can shatter walls of lies and manipulation. Only truth can break toxic bonds, can give you the strength to begin anew. I lay in bed beside Mauricio, listening to the soft breath of my daughter in the next room. Closed my eyes and smiled. Life was beautiful. Not perfect, not simple, but beautiful. And I would live it fully, honestly, without looking back. The story was over. The circle closed. The woman who had once stood humiliated and betrayed in that banquet hall was gone. In her place stood me, new, strong, free, and that was all that mattered.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.